Grand Central Station, New York City, Platform 7, a rainy Tuesday in November. Jake Morrison, 25, bartender making $2,000 a month plus tips, saw an elderly woman collapse onto the tracks just as the Metro North Express was approaching. Without thinking, he jumped down, risking his life to save her. What he didn't know was that he'd just saved Margaret Blackstone, owner of a $3 billion tech empire. But the real shock came when, 3 days later, Jake was summoned to the Blackstone estate in the Hamptons. Margaret didn't just want to thank him. She'd discovered that Jake was the man her daughter Elizabeth had been secretly in love with for years, but couldn't marry because he wasn't from their world. The proposal Margaret made to Jake stunned all of Manhattan's elite. $5 million to marry her daughter and save the Blackstone dynasty from ruin. But there was a secret no one knew. Jake and Elizabeth had already been secretly married for 8 months. Jake Morrison rushed through Grand Central Station with his breath coming in gasps, his dark hair plastered to his forehead from the rain. It was 6:47 p.m., and he'd missed the 6:30 train to Queens, where he lived with his sick father in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment. The next train wasn't until 7:15, meaning he'd be late giving his dad his 8 o'clock medication. He worked at Murphy's Bar on the Lower East Side, 10-hour shifts on his feet for barely enough to survive in New York. His worn jeans and faded Yankees hoodie stood out among the expensive suits of Manhattan commuters. But Jake had long stopped caring about appearances. Survival didn't leave room for vanity. He sat on a bench at Platform 7, mentally counting the money left in his wallet. $42 until payday. Still 5 days away. He had to choose between buying his father's heart medication or eating. As always, he'd choose the medication. That's when he noticed the elderly woman, elegant in a way that screamed old money, not new wealth. Black Chanel suit, Hermes bag, shoes that probably cost more than Jake made in 3 months. But something was off about how she walked, stumbling, one hand pressed to her chest. The woman stopped right at the platform edge, swaying dangerously. Jake stood instinctively. Other passengers kept walking, too absorbed in their phones to notice. The woman stepped back, then her legs gave out. Time slowed. Jake saw the elderly woman's body fall onto the tracks, heard the whistle of the incoming express, saw the display reading, "Arriving, Platform 7. He didn't think. He jumped. The impact with the rails knocked the wind out of him. The elderly woman was unconscious, heavier than she looked. The train was 200 yards away, and not slowing enough. Jake used all the strength he had. Years of hauling kegs at the bar, finally useful. He rolled with the woman toward the space under the platform, pressing against the concrete wall. The train passed inches from them, hot metallic wind blasting them, the deafening noise seeming endless. Jake held the elderly woman tight, feeling her weak breath against his chest, praying to gods he no longer believed in. When the train finally stopped, chaos erupted. Screams, whistles, people running. 2 transit workers jumped down to help them back up. The elderly woman was pale, but breathing. Jake had a gash on his forehead bleeding profusely and an ankle screaming in pain. But he was alive. Paramedics arrived within minutes. As they loaded the elderly woman onto a stretcher, she opened her eyes and grabbed Jake's hand with surprising strength. Her eyes were the same steel gray as someone Jake knew all too well, but in that moment, he was too shocked to make the connection. The police asked him endless questions. Reporters, alerted by passengers with smartphones ready, began crowding around. Jake just wanted to leave, get back to his father, forget everything. He gave a fake name to the reporters, Mike Johnson, and escaped as soon as possible, limping toward the exit. He didn't see the woman in a business suit who'd been watching from a distance the whole time, her face a mask of shock and something resembling fear. Elizabeth Blackstone had recognized both her mother and the man she'd secretly married 8 months ago. Castle of lies they'd built was about to collapse. 3 days later, Jake was wiping down the bar when his manager called him to the office. There were two men in dark suits who looked like bodyguards, and a woman in a gray suit who radiated efficiency. The woman introduced herself as Patricia Chen, personal assistant to Mrs. Margaret Blackstone. The name made Jake's blood freeze. Blackstone, like Elizabeth Blackstone, like the woman he'd married in secret at a small courthouse in Vermont 8 months ago, far from prying eyes. The assistant explained that Mrs. Blackstone wished to thank her savior personally. A car would be waiting the next day at 2 p.m. to take him to the Blackstone estate in the Hamptons. It wasn't exactly a request. The tone made that clear. Jake spent a sleepless night. Elizabeth had told him about her mother, widowed for 10 years, matriarch of a tech empire built from nothing, iron woman who'd already rejected 15 potential sons-in-law because they weren't worthy of the Blackstone name. Their secret marriage had been Elizabeth's idea, tired of her mother's pressure to marry the heir to some other industrial dynasty. The plan was simple: marry in secret, wait for Elizabeth to consolidate her position in the family company, then reveal everything when her mother could no longer do anything about it. Meanwhile, Jake continued his normal life, seeing Elizabeth only when she could get away with elaborate excuses. The black Bentley arrived on time. The driver, a man in his 60s with impeccable manners, didn't say a word during the 2-hour drive. Jake watched the landscape change from urban to suburban to rural, the houses getting bigger and more spaced out, until they turned onto a private drive lined with century-old oaks. The Blackstone estate took his breath away, not in the gaudy way of new money, but with that whispered elegance that comes from generations of wealth. White marble, 18th-century paintings, English gardens that looked like they'd stepped out of a Jane Austen novel. Margaret Blackstone waited in the main drawing room, seated in a chair that looked like a throne. At 70, she was still formidable. Silver hair pulled back in a perfect chignon, black dress that screamed haute couture, gray eyes that seemed to see through people. She stood when Jake entered, something she probably didn't do for many. She approached and, to Jake's surprise, hugged him. Not a formal embrace, but something genuine, almost desperate. When they separated, Margaret had tears in her eyes. She began thanking him, talking about how doctors had told her that without Jake's intervention, she would have died. A heart attack, right as she was about to take the train to Boston for a crucial board meeting. Then came the first bomb. Margaret knew who Jake really was. She'd had him investigated, obviously. She knew about his sick father, the bartending job, the community college degree he'd never finished, even the $42 in his wallet. What she didn't know was about the secret marriage. Margaret had Jake sit down and began speaking with the brutal frankness of someone accustomed to command. The Blackstone Empire was in crisis, not financial, but dynastic. Elizabeth, her only daughter, at 28, categorically refused to marry. She'd rejected the senator's son, the Vanderbilt heir, even a minor European prince. Margaret had made peace with the idea of not having grandchildren, but there was a bigger problem. The board of directors, composed of old dinosaurs, threatened to remove Elizabeth from succession if she wasn't settled within the year. She needed a husband, and fast. Then Margaret said something that almost made Jake fall off his chair. She knew Elizabeth was in love with him. She'd had her followed for months, worried about her strange behavior. She knew about the secret meetings, the weekends when she disappeared with increasingly elaborate excuses. But here was the twist in Margaret's mind. She thought Elizabeth didn't have the courage to introduce him to her, terrified of her judgment. And she was right, in a way. They'd just gone well beyond simple dating. Margaret's proposal was insane in its simplicity. $5 million cash, immediately, plus a monthly allowance of $100,000 if Jake agreed to marry Elizabeth. Margaret would handle everything: the board's opposition, integration into high society, even etiquette lessons if necessary. Jake almost laughed at the irony. The mother-in-law Elizabeth, painted as a dragon, was begging him to marry her daughter, unaware they were already married. But before he could respond, the drawing-room door burst open. Elizabeth Blackstone entered like a fury, tall, elegant, those gray eyes identical to her mother's, beautiful in that aristocratic way that turned heads. Her face went from fury to shock when she saw Jake. Margaret misinterpreted her reaction. She thought Elizabeth was surprised to see the man she was secretly in love with there. She began excitedly explaining her plan, how she'd discovered everything, how Jake was perfect, how he'd saved her. Elizabeth looked between her mother and her secret husband, panic in her eyes. Jake gave her an imperceptible shake of his head. Not now, not like this. But Margaret, in her excitement, kept talking, revealing detail after detail of how she'd spied on her daughter, how she approved of the choice, how Jake was exactly the kind of man the Blackstone Empire needed, brave, selfless, with real values.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
Dinner was surreal. Margaret had insisted Jake stay, had the guest suite prepared, had even sent someone to buy new clothes for him. Elizabeth was pale, drinking too much wine, shooting desperate glances at Jake, who pretended not to know her more than necessary. Margaret was radiant, already planning the wedding of the century. She talked about how she'd present Jake to New York society, how she'd silence those old fossils on the board, how grandchildren would run through the estate gardens. It was when Margaret pulled out the family photo album that the situation spiraled. She turned a page and stopped on a photo of Elizabeth as a child. Next to it, a photo of her wedding to her late husband. Jake looked at the date and paled. It was the same date as their secret wedding, May 15th. Elizabeth noticed and knew the game was over. She stood, went to the liquor cabinet, pulled out a bottle of aged scotch and poured herself a generous glass. Then, in a strangely calm voice, she said the words that changed everything. "Mother, I need to tell you something. Jake and I are already married." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret looked from one to the other, her brain processing the information. Then, instead of the fury both expected, she burst out laughing. She laughed until she cried, holding her sides, while Elizabeth and Jake watched in amazement. When she finally calmed down, Margaret wiped her eyes and said something that shocked them even more. She knew. Not about the marriage. No, but she knew they were seriously involved. The spying plan had been a charade. She wanted to see how far they'd go to protect each other. But the secret marriage exceeded her expectations. Her daughter, the coward who didn't dare introduce a boyfriend, had had the courage to marry in secret. And Jake, the man who'd risked his life for a stranger, was already her son-in-law without knowing it. Margaret stood, went to the safe hidden behind a Monet, a real Monet, Jake realized with shock, and pulled out a yellow envelope. She handed it to Jake. Inside were property deeds, a penthouse in Manhattan, made out to the future Mr. Blackstone, dated 3 years earlier. Elizabeth was stunned. Her mother had bought a house for her future husband 3 years ago, when she swore she'd never marry. Margaret smiled with that wisdom of mothers who always know more than they let on. She'd always known her daughter would find the right man. She just had to wait for her to find him herself. News of the secret marriage exploded like a bomb in New York high society. The New York Times headline read, "Blackstone heiress secretly married to Grand Central hero." Gossip flew. Some said Jake was a gold digger who'd orchestrated everything, others that Elizabeth had been forced by her mother. The board of directors called an emergency meeting. Some members were furious about the deception, others relieved that Elizabeth was finally married. But it was Margaret who dominated the scene, entering the boardroom with Jake at her side, both in power suits that screamed battle. Margaret presented Jake not as the bartender he was, but as the man who'd risked his life to save a stranger, who'd grown up caring for a sick father. who'd worked his way through community college, who'd married Elizabeth for love, not money, so much so that he didn't even know who Margaret was when he'd saved her. Old Harrison Whitfield, the most conservative board member, made the mistake of insinuating that Jake wasn't from their world. Margaret destroyed him by reminding him that his grandfather sold rags at Ellis Island, that the Blackstone family came from nothing and got there with work and courage, exactly like Jake. But the real twist came when Jake spoke. Calmly and precisely, he analyzed the company's financials from the last 5 years, proposed strategies for entering the Asian market, suggested an affordable tech line that would triple profits. His incomplete community college education hid years of self-taught study in business, dreaming of one day escaping poverty. The board fell silent. Then, one by one, they began applauding. Even Whitfield, reluctantly, admitted the boy had potential. But there was a bigger problem to face. Jake's father, Robert, knew nothing about the marriage. Jake had kept him in the dark to protect him from stress. Now they had to tell him and introduce him to the family he didn't know he had. The meeting took place in the Queen's apartment. Margaret insisted on going there, despite Elizabeth's protests that they should bring Robert to the estate. Seeing how Jake and his father lived broke her heart. The contrast with her luxury was stark. Robert, frail and pale, but with the same proud eyes as his son, welcomed Margaret with dignity. He wasn't intimidated by the name or expensive clothes. When he learned about the secret marriage, his first concern was whether Elizabeth treated his son well. Margaret and Robert hit it off immediately. Two parents who'd sacrificed everything for their children, separated by wealth, but united by parental love. Margaret insisted Robert move to the estate for better care. Robert agreed only on condition of paying symbolic rent. A year later, the Blackstone estate was transformed, not physically, but in atmosphere. Laughter filled rooms that had been silent for a decade. Robert had taken over the kitchen, scandalizing the French chef with his Queen's recipes, but winning everyone over with his homemade pasta. Jake had revolutionized the company. The affordable line he'd proposed was a global success. Blackstone for Everyone had democratized American tech luxury, tripling profits and hiring hundreds of people, many from Queens and the Bronx, giving opportunities to those who'd never had them. But the biggest change was in Elizabeth. No longer the spoiled heiress hiding behind secrets, she'd become a true leader, inspired by her husband's courage, who'd risked everything for a stranger. Together, they'd created a foundation to support deserving but poor students, titled the Robert Morrison Foundation. The real wedding, the public one, was celebrated exactly 1 year after the rescue at Grand Central, not at St. Patrick's Cathedral as society wanted, but in the small church in Queens where Jake had been baptized. Robert, miraculously improved thanks to better care, walked Jake down the aisle alongside Margaret, two parents united in love for their children. During the reception, at the same Blackstone estate, but opened for the occasion to the entire Queens neighborhood where Jake grew up, Margaret gave a speech that went down in history. She told how an unknown young man had saved her twice, physically on the tracks, and spiritually by showing her that true nobility isn't in blood, but in actions. She revealed a secret she'd kept to herself. That morning at the station, she was going to Boston to sell the company. She was tired, alone, convinced Elizabeth would never find happiness. She'd decided to liquidate everything and retire. The heart attack had stopped her, and Jake had saved her. But discovering that her savior was also the man her daughter loved had given her the will to live and fight again. Elizabeth took the floor, looking Jake in the eyes in front of 500 guests. She confessed that their secret marriage hadn't been just from fear of maternal judgment, but to protect Jake from the ruthless world of high society. But she'd understood that Jake didn't need protection. He was the one who protected others, who saved strangers on tracks, who transformed empires with his ideas. Jake, in a simple but elegant suit he'd bought himself. Another surprise, he had excellent taste, and his first fashion collaboration would launch the following year. Thanked everyone, but especially the two parents. Robert, who'd raised him with love despite poverty. Margaret, who'd welcomed him despite prejudices. But the most touching moment came when Elizabeth announced she was pregnant, with twins, a boy and a girl. The names were already decided. Matthew after Margaret's father, founder of the Blackstone Empire, and Sarah after Jake's mother, whom he'd never known, but whom Robert described as a woman who would have risked her life to save a stranger. The circle was closing. The Blackstone Empire had its heirs, the board was placated, but most importantly, a family broken by death and loneliness was reborn. Not through corporate mergers or arranged marriages, but through a pure act of altruism on a train platform. 5 years later, interviewed by Forbes as one of America's most influential couples, Jake and Elizabeth told the complete story. The journalist asked if Jake had ever regretted jumping onto the tracks that day. Jake, with the twins playing at his feet in the office he shared with Elizabeth, Margaret entering with Robert for the now traditional Sunday lunch, answered simply, "That jump didn't just save Mrs. Blackstone, it saved all of us. It saved Elizabeth from the prison of appearances, Margaret from the loneliness of power, my father from illness with care we could never have afforded, and me from the conviction that my destiny was sealed by birth. But most importantly, it proved that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in courage, and that the strongest families are those chosen through love and sacrifice, not those imposed by blood or money." The interview closed with a photo. 4 generations of Blackstones. Margaret, Robert, Jake, and Elizabeth, and little Sarah, 3 years old, identical to the grandmother she'd never known, but who, as Jake always said, lived in every act of courage and altruism the family performed. And at Grand Central Station, a golden plaque on Platform 7 then read, "Here on November 15th, Jake Morrison saved Margaret Blackstone, proving that a single act of courage can change infinite lives. True nobility is measured in actions, not titles." Hit like if you believe true courage is helping without expecting anything in return. Comment with the moment that moved you most. Share with someone who needs to know that destiny always rewards those who act with their heart. Subscribe for more stories that prove how a single gesture can change entire dynasties.